Hello you lovely lot and welcome to a brand new video. My name is Katie and we're going to play about with some graphite today and introduce a few coloured pencils in there too. I've been working through my studio space and just trying to tidy up and organise it somewhat, and one of you lovely lot suggested in my previous video that I should try some coloured pencils with graphite. Well, at the time of doing that, the graphite pencils and the coloured pencils were getting sorted out, so I thought, well, now they're all nicely organised, I should actually use them, so this was a great opportunity to do so. The paper I'm using is the Hahnemühle Anniversary Edition sketch paper. It's 140 GSM and we're on an A4 sheet of paper today. And the majority of pencils that I use in this are the Tonal ones, which I've just received over the years through Scrawlerbox or through Upcrate. There's also a cheeky Derwent sketching pencil in there, and of course we cannot forget those big chunky graphite sticks that we received in the November Scrawlerbox, because they are just perfect for sketching like this. Now, it's not very often I show the initial beginnings of any artworks. I've usually got something pre-drawn out. As you'll see, I've just marked down the basic areas of where things go. There's no point going into too much detail straight away. You want to make sure the proportions are at a place you're happy with before starting to hone in on those details. After I'd added those initial anchor points, we'll say, I decided to add a hard surface underneath. It is just a plain piece of Perspex, but for some reason I like to have a very sturdy surface underneath when I'm using graphite pencils as well as coloured pencils. I tend to find if I work from the pad, and I'm sure you've known before that I've mentioned I'm quite heavy-handed, there tends to be an impression that goes through the pages and that spoils the page underneath. So at this stage it's time to add a hard surface underneath, and I've just got some Perspex lying around, so that was ideal. However, if you haven't got that, then a clipboard will be fine. And another reason as well I add this is because I actually just kind of like the feedback from the pressure I put down. It gives me a better gauge as to whether I'm putting too much pressure down or not. So we're at this stage now where I'm wanting to fill in the areas of the face which have the most shadow. This is a good reference point for me. It's not quite the deepest tone on there, but I'd say it's the closest I'm going to get to a mid-tone. And because I'm using white paper as well, I don't have a mid-tone automatically there, so it's time to kind of just add one there. I'm also using blending stumps to smooth things out a little, and to be honest, I'd say these past 12 months I've started using blending stumps more and more. Normally I'd use cotton buds or Q-tips to smoosh things around, however I do kind of find that they wear down quite quickly, and sometimes you do get a bit of residue there as well. Cotton tips are not always the best things to use either. Again, referring back to having a lot of pressure when I draw, I kind of end up grinding it down to the stick in the middle and it starts scratching the paper. So I guess from a more pragmatic point of view, it's time to start using blending stumps. I also took advantage of how dusty these can get as well, especially the graphite stick, which is not a bad thing. I used a paintbrush, which perhaps I don't use so much to paint with anymore. Make sure it's a soft one, and that's really good for just brushing the excess dust that comes off, and again, just creating a bit more of a mid-tone there. Now, I felt at this stage of the drawing it was time to really get the darkest tones on there, and that is of course for the hair. And I'm hoping at this point you can kind of realise who I'm drawing here. It is of course Wednesday Addams, and from the Netflix series. Yes, I watched all of it and I quite enjoyed it. It was quite a little different from the Addams Family Values, which was like the early 90s, but I actually quite liked the modern adaptation of it. And of course felt compelled to do a drawing, and as well she seems to be quite a popular subject in the art community at the moment, so I thought why not as well. Using such moody tones like these, the graphite just seemed perfect for it. And I am quite enjoying using these dry mediums at the moment. There's a lot less prep work involved beforehand, which I'm totally on board with, and I am being very good at the moment and trying to keep things organised, so the graphite just seemed like a good option right now whilst I'm sorting out the absolute tip that is my studio. Now you'll notice that I changed paintbrushes, and I do have a couple on the go for this. The softer one with the longer bristles is just perfect for sweeping over a general larger area, whereas this short flat-haired brush worked really well for just starting to carve out details. The Hahnemühle paper, I mean, I've had this for absolutely ages. I got it from the art shop that closed down last year, but I've had it for a couple of years. And although it's quite a smooth paper, there's just enough tooth in there which hangs on to those graphite dust particles really well. Which is why I decided to shave the big chunky graphite stick and create some dust which I could, I guess, paint on like you would with any painting medium really. Two reasons why I did this. The first reason was I wasn't quite getting enough dust off the hair of Wednesday to sort of lift it up and drag it across the face, and secondly, referring back to the paper, the particles were just small enough to sit in there and carve around and work with. And yes, I do dip into Wednesday's hair a little bit to pull some off, but the majority of these softer areas was literally just lifted out of that dish and placed down. And this is a really good technique, again, to create your mid-tones there without having to commit to creating any pencil marks. I also forgot to mention I end up using a Viking pencil there, and that is in the 8B. And I use that because it is super duper dark. The chunky graphite pencil, well, graphite stick is a 6B, and the clutch pencil is a 4B. So I just wanted something where I could just have a little bit more refinement as well as a bit more tonal depth. For me personally, graphite is one of those things, I suppose graphite and pencil drawings in general, is one of those things where I don't do it for ages and then maybe a subscription box comes along or I'm gifted a nice pencil set and it kind of spurs me back into action. It's one of those, I guess, fundamental beginner's art supplies, and it's easily accessible. And it is something we were encouraged to do a lot of back in my college days. We used to have life drawing classes, and maybe one day I'll talk about those a little bit more. But I did pick up some rather excellent skills. When I went into college, I just was that girl who drew dragons and did paintings of dragons, and I hadn't really got a huge amount of drawing and portrait experience at that point. You could say I was quite abysmal at it, to be honest, and a couple of things did help to improve that. Having a newfound liking for manga and anime was the first one. Obviously, the proportions in these faces are quite different. However, it did help me, I guess, maybe encourage me to try portraits a little bit more and at least apply some of my understanding of that to more realistic drawing. But another aspect was how we were taught to draw, and more importantly, how we were taught to look at the subject. And this was really valuable again in life drawing. It's something I dip into now and then, obviously outside of my college days, but life commitments, work, I just don't quite have the time to go to these classes at the moment. So they're on pause for now, and I guess this is where I'm getting my portrait fix from. Now you'll notice a little bit on the left hand side of Wednesday's head there. I did have to bring that hairline in a little bit. I think it was just protruding a little bit too much, and at this stage it was starting to look a lot better. I used a kneadable eraser to remove the bulk and then a solid eraser afterwards, and that little green pen thing is a very fine eraser which is super useful for doing portraits like this, or any graphite work actually. It just means you can lift away some areas a little bit more intricately. You'll see as well that I added another dusting of graphite to the background there, and again I just didn't want it to be on that stark background, and also it covered a few sins there, especially around that hairline area where I just wanted it to blend in as well. It just came to a point where I could not lift out anymore, and that was my fault. I'd committed to that area a little bit too soon, pressed down too hard with the graphite and it just wouldn't quite lift. So adding that background not only adds a little atmosphere, but covers a multitude of sins, and that's totally okay. And I guess that highlights my point at the start of the video when I was mapping things out. Don't commit to one area too much to begin with until you're relatively certain that all of your provisional lines are in place before going to town on the details and on the tones there. One of my favourite parts of drawing, and I guess it's one of those things I like to save as a treat for doing the bits I don't like on a picture, and that was adding the hair detail in there. It was just really nice. It was a high contrast picture. And another thing I really liked, which I thought worked out well, was the shadow area I'm drawing right now from the hair that's on the right hand side of her face. I made sure to do that very, very lightly, but with the 8B pencil, and then gradually blend it in so it did look like shadow and not another piece of hair. Although saying that though, looking at the reference photo, which again you'll be able to Google it, it's everywhere at the moment, it was quite hard to be able to distinguish between the two, but because of how the shadow lies across her cheekbones, that's how I knew it was a shadow and not a piece of hair. It was time to start filling in the area where her fabulous dress is, and again it's quite dark, so I had to plan ahead and add that mid-tone on there, because I think if I'd left it white it just would have been too stark of a contrast. This is where that big chunky graphite stick again came in super useful. I'm not pressing on too hard here, and I'm keeping my mark making relatively even-ish, well, as even as I can do it. And then it's time to go in with that good old blender. Now, I did notice the blender would clog up quite quickly with graphite, so the best thing to do is to get a bit of sandpaper and just scrape it away, repoint the tip, and then you're good to go again. And for good measure, I went over it again in that 8B pencil, and it just helped to add a little bit of definition where the folds of the dress are, as well as adding that depth, which I so definitely needed. And by this point though, there was a lot of graphite floating over that area, and the page was becoming quite slippy, so I just took a little mini break from that for a second, had a little think about how I was going to attack it, and then I'd kind of just carried on again anyway. That good old blending stump definitely helped things out. Luckily as well, because that was one of the darkest areas on the picture, same as her hair, I wasn't too bothered about overly applying the graphite. I wanted it as dark and as smooth as I could get it, so that was fine. I used a kneadable eraser and formed it into a bit of a point just so I could lift some of those slightly lighter highlighted areas, and then when it came to adding those light details in her hair, that little tiny eraser, green pen I'm using was perfect. However, you could also use one of those erasers that you get on a mechanical pencil that's got a very similar size surface, so that should work out too. And we are pretty much done. I did add a bit of a bokeh effect in the background, and that was just by dabbing that kneaded eraser on there, because the picture I worked from kind of had that going on too, and I kind of like it. But anyway, let's see if we can use coloured pencils alongside graphite. The ones I'm using are the Castle ones, and they are the Kandinsky set. And I've done a whole video featuring those, so be sure to check that one out if you haven't already. One of you lovely lot had mentioned in my previous video that you wanted to see me give it a try because you were finding it could be a little bit muddy, and I totally get that. Before adding the coloured pencil though, and off camera, I did add a fixative spray. It was the De La Roni pastel one because that's the only one I had, but it kept the graphite where I wanted it to be. For me, mixing graphite and coloured pencils is a bit of a tricky one, and I think the best approach in my opinion is to see as a tint. Unless you're actually going to do separate areas, it is going to look a little bit muddy, but I think if you consider the subject you're drawing as well as areas you're going to add colour, I think it can be quite nice and effective. Of course, with Wednesday Addams being allergic to colour, I made sure to keep the minimum on her and just coloured in her lips. Again, it's quite striking and stylised, and I think it works. And for the background, I just added a yellow ochre kind of colour. Again, it's just to match the reference picture I was working off. In a way, it kind of reminded me of the Derwent graphite pencils. And again, they are quite moody and tonal. And that's the idea of it. I think if you're going to try this, two things: consider your subject matter and make a decision as to whether you want to blend those pencils in with the graphite or have it working alongside there. This is something as well I might touch on in future videos, but I just saw this as a great opportunity. So here is the finished piece now. Overall, it took me about 3 hours to complete from start to finish, and I absolutely loved doing this. And who knows, I might do another portrait in the future. I'm going to have to just see how tidying up my studio space goes along and make sure I don't get too distracted by the stuff I find. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. I do want to say thank you so much for watching. And there should be some more videos on screen I think you'll enjoy. In the meantime, I'll see you lovely lot soon. Bye!